airplanes, including the subsystems that Dr. Ike just described, with the design, the build, and the support area of the fleet.
And if you would please give us a high-level overview right now, or I guess actually prior to the accident, of what your voluntary SMS program looks like.
Sure. Maybe I'll use a couple of exhibits that I think will help a little bit. The first one, if you could please pull up the Boeing slide 9, just to give a feel for where we are timeline-wise. Thank you. The Boeing was approved under the voluntary program in 2020, and then in 2021, very similar to the timeline that was just laid out, the operational approval was granted in 2021. So from a maturity level following the voluntary program requirements, we've since, and I'll describe a little further as to what it really looks like, been developing SMS deeper and deeper into the organization, starting with the accountable executive, which is the top risk acceptor at the company, and working our way down through those design, build, and operate systems. And to give a feel at what that looks like, I'd ask if we could go to the Boeing slide 8. So for those of you who don't see safety management system in your regular world, this is a really good way to look at it. And it starts off with the pillars and having a safety policy and objectives clearly written. Safety risk management is the mitigation of known hazards. And safety assurance, what that term really means is your hazard detection system. So that's the channels, that's your employee reporting, your KPIs, your audits, your change management processes. And then safety promotion, that fourth pillar, is really key because that is how you promote SMS throughout the organization, through training, communication, and participation. And the three areas below are really critical. With the top level commitment, that's the leadership commitment through those subsystems, the positive safety culture, which I'm sure we'll talk about more, and the continuous improvement loop. I'm sure you'll hear more of that as many of us speak, having a way to get feedback as to how the SMS is working to continually make it better. And those two middle pillars, those are really the engine of SMS, with hazard detection being where we understand where our risks are, safety assurance, safety risk management, doing the assessment and mitigation, and then back into safety assurance to assure that that mitigation worked. So when we talk about where Boeing is in our SMS, we've implemented through our design, build, and operate systems, and we operate those through 7 SMS boards. We have 3 cross-functional boards, 1 for build, 1 for operate, and 1 for design. And then each program has a program-specific board that are responsible for these elements.
Dr. Ike, 2 formal apologies. One, I apologize for not using your title earlier properly. And the second is I'm going to go back a bit. You touched on the AXA rule and the requirements that were imposed upon Boeing for the development of their voluntary SMS. Can you go into just a little bit more detail about the circumstances surrounding that and how that process was initiated?
I'm not sure I understand the question for AXA.
Under AXA, there was a rule requiring, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, for Boeing to establish a voluntary SMS.
Not under AXA.
Okay.
That I'm aware of. At least maybe there's a different provision of AXA that I'm just not aware of. The key one that I was aware of is it required companies, all companies that hold the type certificate and a production certificate for the same product to implement an SMS. That was section 102, I believe.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what was the reasoning for that? How did we get to that point?
I don't have all the background, but it was likely a cause from prior accidents on the 737 MAXs that And Congress then enacted this requirement to implement an SMS across design and manufacturing.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted that to be established because I wanted to give a little bit of history as to why this came to be and at this time. Moving back to Mr. Wright. Ultimately, who's responsible for managing your, at this point, voluntary SMS program and ensuring its success at Boeing?
The accountability for SMS is quite specific, and we align to the ICAO standards there. So, we talk about implementation organizationally. My organization, the Chief Aerospace Safety Office, is responsible for the implementation and the planning. But when we talk about the execution, we have an accountable executive, Chief Aerospace Safety Officer, and then we have our series of risk acceptors throughout the organization, and that really has a role for everybody at the company in the SMS, which is critical. So we rely on our employees to report hazards and participate in risk mitigation for those hazards that are in their area. And we also rely on many organizations that are part of the policy and promotion. So when we talk about who's responsible, there's roles for everybody, and there's different places where risk is accepted.
Okay, we are going to step through the different foundations of SMS in a little bit and talk about each of those in greater detail. But right now, I just want to have an understanding of how your voluntary SMS came to be. So with that, I'm actually going to move to the FAA. I see you guys back there. Mr. Slagle, if you would please just give us a high-level overview of what your job was and what your role was in helping Boeing to develop their voluntary SMS.
Thank you. My involvement with the voluntary SMS program started back in 2017. I was a national team lead for the program, and Boeing was one of the companies that I was assigned. My duties and responsibilities were to help Boeing understand the program and help them as they work through their implementation process. There is a slide, FAA slide number 8. If you could pull that up, it shows a basic outline of what we did to get Boeing through the process. If you look at that second bullet, the steps, the applicant, Boeing needed to show interest in the program. They developed a system description, very rudimentary compared to what we have today with the rule. They developed a safety policy and a gap analysis. They provided that to the FAA. The FAA reviewed it and basically okayed it. From there, Boeing went on to develop processes and procedures. We were involved with Boeing as they were working through this process, so we were pretty aware with what was going on at Boeing. At the completion of that point, the FAA did what we called a compliance assessment. That was basically looking at the processes and procedures that were in place and that they met the requirements of either National Aerospace Standard 9927 and also Part 5 as it existed at that point in time. From that point, so some of the observations that we made were based on a desktop or a simulation of the procedure working. completion of the performance evaluation, another acceptance was not given to Boeing. We just went with the original acceptance from the December compliance evaluation. So at that point, Boeing had an accepted SMS by us meeting the requirements of 9927 or Part 5.
And after that point, is there any sort of continued monitoring to ensure that improvements are made or that it still meets, I guess, the voluntary SMS standards that were set forth?
The way the voluntary program was set up is the performance evaluation was the last evaluation that we did, and it was incumbent on the oversight office to continue monitoring, but it was nothing that was really documented at that time. So I know that at the time it was the Certificate Management Office, the CMO, continued to do observations and interactions with Boeing. I know that the CMO personnel participated with Boeing in safety risk management activities. The CMO manager at the time was very passionate about SMS and oftentimes brought things up when an issue would arise in the company. I know he would ask, "What's your SMS say? What does your SMS tell you to do?" So that was basically the oversight that took place. Nothing extremely formal, but the routine interaction was monitored, and the SMS principles and tenets were overseen.
And I am going to move to Mr. Knopp in a moment to talk a little bit more about what monitoring looks like under a voluntary program. But before I do that, if at any time during this process and even shortly thereafter, after that last performance evaluation was made, if Boeing had questions or wanted to reach out or needed more information about how to help facilitate their program, who would be their direct line at the FAA?
At that time, there was a wealth of information in the manager of the CMO. And I know that Boeing could go to him at any time and ask questions and get information about SMS. They could also reach out to me and my organization and ask questions if they had questions about anything that they were working on, clarifying information about what later progressed in the voluntary program to the data collection tools. So there was a lot of interaction back and forth between the Boeing SMS folks and us in the FAA.
And now, Mr. Knopp, given that this is a voluntary structure, first, welcome. I don't think we've had a chance to talk to you yet. What is your role and responsibility at the FAA?
Yeah, good morning. My name is Brian Knopp. I'm the manager of the System Operation and Oversight Branch. That is responsible for oversight of Boeing, GE, and Pratt & Whitney for their production, ODA, and SMS.
So now going back to the fact that it is a voluntary program, what does oversight look like for a voluntary SMS?
So for a voluntary SMS, there isn't any mandatory oversight. We did meet regularly with the SMS leaders at Boeing. As Steve had mentioned, the previous manager provided a significant amount of insight due to his previous experience in Part 121 as they implemented SMS. But it was regular meetings, and we participated in safety risk management activities that Boeing had identified that were related to the parts of the company that we that it was the extent of our oversight, and certainly, providing guidance when there was questions, as we knew the rule was coming, ensuring that they were ready, to satisfy those requirements.
So I've heard both of you mention a couple times now that you had a person at the CMO who was very knowledgeable, who was passionate about it, and who was very involved, which it sounds like we got lucky. I guess, what do you have in place if that person isn't knowledgeable and passionate and ready to go?
Right. Certainly, as SMS is now a formal rule, there is training in place for all of our staff. And we've identified a number of our staff to go to in-person training around SMS and become familiar with each of our applicants' SMS, the way they're organized, so that we are ready to implement the rule and provide, oversight of the now formal rule.
Okay, so given that some of that formal training hasn't come yet, understandably, ASIs, or aviation safety inspectors, what would you say in their day-to-day functions, what percentage of that is dealing with specific issues to Boeing's SMS, voluntary SMS?
I'd say the majority of their time is spent on the quality system at this point. So our involvement in, like I'd mentioned before, in their SMS is mostly our participation in safety risk management exercises that Boeing is doing. We do have a handful of folks that participate regularly in the biweekly meetings to understand what risks Boeing is looking at. I think now, is a good time. We do have a tri-party agreement with Boeing, IEM, and ourselves to implement an ASAP. It is the first design and manufacture ASAP, and we're working through that. And that is a process to review Speakup reports, which is also, obviously a part of Boeing's SMS.
Aside from the Speakup reports, are there any other reports or metrics that Boeing produces that the FAA also reviews specifically to its voluntary SMS?
We certainly review their risk register. It's not something we make a decision on or are a part of their approval, but we certainly review how Boeing is determining risks of the So I don't know. I think we would have a bigger role in how Boeing does, manages their risk register, but I don't foresee us determining the risk level of SRMs per se.
Do you have an idea of what the FAA is going to be looking for in that interaction between Boeing's QMS and their SMS?
We would certainly expect the QMS to provide triggers to the SMS, right? So that when there is an issue with the QMS, that should trigger their SMS to do a safety risk management exercise. And so we would be monitoring various metrics, some that were mentioned yesterday, to ensure that if those control limits were triggered or potentially other ones, Boeing was conducting an SRM for that. Additionally, if they were making changes to their quality system, they would do an SRM in advance to ensure that they understood all the risks that were a part of the change they were planning to make.
So far, under the voluntary system, what are some of the things that the FAA has observed in Boeing's interface between their QMS and their voluntary SMS, recognizing that ASIs haven't been fully trained and it's not a requirement yet?
So we've certainly seen examples of where risks that either we've identified or Boeing has identified themselves have driven SRMs. One of the examples is the removals process that was in the factual report that Boeing, had identified as an issue and had a active safety risk management activity started in, I believe, July of 2023. prior to the accident. So that's an example of them identifying issues and starting a safety risk management. We've seen that in certainly in other areas as well.
Thank you. So now, Mr. Wright, we are going to walk through the different fundamentals of what makes up an SMS program. And for those that are unaware, that's safety assurance, safety risk assessment, safety policy, and safety promotion. So we're going to start off with safety policy. Tell me about how Boeing applies safety policy and what that means under your voluntary SMS.
Happy to. The safety policy is, just to kind of give some context, is we developed our SMS. We relied a lot on input from airlines who had been conducting SMS activities, many for a decade, which is very helpful, and also across other OEMs. And we found the most effective way to have a safety policy was to put it on one page that everybody in the organization could digest easily, as opposed to a deep document. And in that safety policy, we walk through our commitments around safety culture, safety risk mitigation, really across the pillars of safety promotion, and also the foundational elements around continuous improvement, leadership commitment, things like that. And that safety policy is signed by our top leadership at the company. And I should note that that policy doesn't just apply to commercial airplanes. We see great value in SMS and are also have SMS implementations in our defense and services businesses.
And if one wanted to know or read up on Boeing safety policies, where do they go?
One would go onto our front page website and search under safety policy, and it would come up. There's also an area of our front web link around the messages from top leadership, and you can find it there. In practice, we review the safety policy. We do safety policy reflections during every review in our SMS. So at lower levels to the highest levels, we will pull up the SMS, and a leader will walk through an element of that, and we'll have a discussion on what that means to us, and that's part of our cultural setting.
When you say we, who are you talking about at that time?
Sure. So just examples. In an SMS, you have an accountable executive review where we review risks. That would be a place for that type of reflection. We have business unit level safety reviews, and that's a business unit CEO and the leadership team. We also do invite the FAA to be part of that. So that leadership level, our SMS boards. So our SMS boards for design, build, operate, as well as the programs. So those are at VPGM level. And I should note that when we say we, the required quorum to make a risk acceptance decision at Boeing, and I believe this follows the standards well, is we have engineering, design's critical area, so the chief project engineer, chief program engineer on any program at Boeing is responsible for product safety and integrity. They're definitely a member of what we call a voting member. The VPGM of the program, and then there's a independent safety officer, that's typically myself, on the business unit or cross-model ones, and a manager in my organization for the program level. That's the core we, and then we include the leadership teams for those specific areas when we're having those discussions. Below that, there are working groups that feed. In an airline environment, you might hear them called data analysis working groups or safety action groups. We call them working groups. Those are the functions that support. So, for instance, the functions that support our build area, our supply chain, our fabrication, our quality, and our operations leaders. There's working groups in those areas, and right now we're right in the midst of developing our data analysis working group structure. So that's what we're in the midst of implementing right now. So when I say we, that's what I'm trying to convey.
So with all those groups of people that you've mentioned, is at any point the IAM invited in to help establish and develop safety policy?
The safety policy is established under the accountable executive, so I'd say no. We do welcome feedback.
So then I guess who is representing the touch labor when you have these quorums?
That touch labor reports to.
However, to be clear, the manager Mr. Catlin, from your point of view as a representative of the IAM, where do you feel union representation should be in the
during verification optimization?
IAM done to have those conversations?
But we are experiencing bi-party agreement.
What year, Mr. Wright?
2020.
So immature it is. Moving to safety assurance, describe some of the indicators that you use to track your performance.
Sure. So we talked a little bit, just to be clear, on timing. Prior to the accident or after, or both?
Prior to the accident, and then I will give you an opportunity to talk about what's going on lately.
Certainly. So prior to the accident, safety assurance, when we look at when we talk through KPIs, they're one piece of the input into the SMS. So I just want to make sure that part's coming through. So we established KPIs in our areas of the company, and for our QMS, or our build processes, those were the escapes we talked about in the different parts of the value stream. And we looked at control limits in those areas, and when they were out of a control limit, a safety risk management was required to be conducted to determine if that process could be corrected with what is called an SMS corrective action, which is bringing something back into process where that process is robust, or if it needed that process to have safety risk management done to it to adjust the controls, add, or clarify. So that's the type of system the KPIs had before.
Please describe Boeing's hazard identification process and who is responsible for identifying hazards.
Absolutely. So hazard identification can come through any of those channels. And the people who work within those channels are the responsible areas. So everybody at the company can use Speakup as a hazard reporting area. Also, hazards can be reported through management, and also you have things like Seek, Speak, and Listens. We talked about stand downs, things like that. Everybody at the company has training and is obligated to report hazards. It's part of our code of conduct, and it's part of our annual training, and I personally use the system.
And I appreciate that. But if I'm coming in off the street and I'm a new mechanic working for Boeing, how do I know what a hazard is?
So during the foundational training, just for instance, and we've learned along the way how to describe what hazards are. SMS can be made to be very simple, but it can also appear quite complex. So from a mechanic standpoint, a hazard is really about any hazard that would impact their personal safety or a hazard that could impact the quality of the airplane. Those are the pieces we want our mechanics to report on. And it could be something that was done incorrectly. It could be something that they see that could be done incorrectly. So it's really about personal safety and quality. And we do have training that points to that.
Talking in timelines, from the point that a hazard is identified all the way up to, I'm moving into safety risk assessment, but until your SMS is activated, essentially, what is the expectation?
It really depends on the hazard. And we've been learning over time, and we've changed our training around the beginning of last year to not only work your hazard with your local management to contain it, but to also put it into the system, because what we might find is there's the same hazard being worked locally across several crews. And if we can see it at the system view, it's a lot easier to understand if we might have a systemic issue. But the timeline is that immediately corrective action must be taken to rectify anything that's happening on the floor. And then depending on the type of hazard, it's either used corrective action to correct, or if it's something that appears to be systemic or high risk, that gets elevated into the SMS resolution structure, which is through those boards I mentioned. So when we think of the timeline, it's hazards reported. We have a triage process to understand what it is, get it to the right spot, and then immediate containment. And then depending on if further action is needed, that could go into the SRM process.
Where do audits fall in your safety assurance component of your SMS?
So audits are a key input. And as we have been looking at how to incorporate audit findings, what we had been doing prior to the accident was looking at top finding areas, kind of a Pareto approach, and applying safety risk management in those areas. And as we've really taken a hard look at our system and ourselves, we've done some realignment since the accident, and we've actually realigned the audit function that used to report through quality, and now it reports through the Chief Aerospace Safety Office as an independent body.
So you talked about systemic issues and those being identified, and then what happens next. What are some of the systemic issues, and I do believe some of them have already been mentioned throughout these 2 days. What are some of the systemic issues that you're finding?
What we find is that a lot of the systemic issues are really well aligned to a lot of the feedback that we've gotten through many channels. And if I give you some examples of them, stamping, tool control, FOD, also things around some of our supply chain elements when we have suppliers of concern with high levels of defects, processes that can be complex and have confusion, such as the removals process that we spent quite a bit of time talking about, we started a safety risk management activity on that from employee reports. And I should correct the date. July has been used. It was March of 2023 when that was identified through the safety assurance channel of Speakup.
So we've heard extensively from quality, and we're going to hear more from the FAA on their audit and oversight process later on this afternoon. But arguably, some of these systemic issues have been around for a while. So the question is then, what is happening under your safety assurance component to where resolution still has not been achieved in these things that have been determined to exist year after year?
Part of it is the historically we didn't have an SMS to elevate through, and that puts a different level of escalation and urgency on an item when it gets into the safety system. The voluntary program has helped us with that. So when we think about understanding something from a safety risk level process, that's really the key element that drives the speed. And we've had a lot of learning, even as we've conducted safety risk assessments, as to how to scope them and how to understand what the what types of tools are the industry best practices, things like that. So with that learning, the speed's increasing, and I'm really very much feeling good about the 90-day plan elements that have sped up some of our process elements. And we've made some major process changes to get initial risk done more quickly to really help drive the urgency to the right place.
Well, we've already bled into safety risk assessment, but to continue with that vein, how exactly does Boeing go about conducting a safety risk assessment? So walk me through, there's been a trigger, it's been identified that an SRA has to occur. What happens next?
You bet. So I'm going to walk you through kind of an administrative element, but it's the assessment and the results that are the important part. So I don't want it to sound overly administrative. The hazard comes in, it is identified and recognized by my organization, and we place it on the risk register. It's assigned a number, and it's put into identification and disposition, which follows the NAS 9972 standard that was referenced earlier. There's standard steps to safety risk management. We follow those. So identification and disposition occurs, a system description is written, and one thing I will note that I feel is very powerful with SMS is it's a system of record, and a hazard or a risk cannot be lost or overcome by events. Once it's there, it's on our books. From there, we move into the risk assessment phase. So we understand what the hazard is. We use a industry standard tool called Bowtie, and we conduct a Bowtie analysis, and depending on the complexity, that can take anywhere from a few weeks to several months to identify the system in what they call this Bowtie, which is the event in the middle you want to avoid, the items in the front. For the pilots out there, it's threat and error management, and then consequences on the other side, and we identify every control, preventative or recovery. And during that assessment, each control is graded using Aerospace Risk Management System, ARMS criteria. That's an industry standard criteria for likelihood and consequence. And from there, the consequence is just the things that can happen on the right side of the bow tie. Those are the things that happen if you, for instance, have a nonconformance with that certain part. What could the consequence be? And if we take a look at the likelihood, that's how strong those controls are. So with the grading of those controls, we get likelihood and consequence, and that gives us a risk level. That risk level there's 5 categories, high to minimal. High risk, an example of a high risk would be one where we would ground a fleet, and that goes to our accountable executive immediately. A serious risk is one where we would stop our production line to prevent a hazard from or a risk from reaching the fleet. And when we get into moderate, that's around regulatory action, things like that, and it goes from there. The next step, once that risk level is established and understood, is to create a control plan. This is an action plan to mitigate the hazards. And the power of this bow tie is when you make an action plan, we've all done it. We think of the actions that will be effective in mitigating the area. What it does is it assesses how strong are those actions and are they the right actions. It uses the hierarchy of controls. So this is remove the hazard, substitute the hazard, engineering controls, which are hard controls, or administrative controls. We look at the strength of those. And we also map the actions to every control in the system. And if we have a control that's rated red and we don't have an action for it, that control plan won't be approved. We also can find through brainstorming that we stack up actions on one control and we leave other ones alone. This bow tie has really helped us see the coverage of the actions and the strength of the actions. Another thing it helps us see is the complexity of the system. If we look at the complexity and we find that we have an inordinate amount of controls that have been added over time, it can call attention to what controls are ineffective and should be removed so that the team is not spending time being stretched on those, and what controls are strong and should be kept so the team can focus and be very good at those. That's how we develop a control plan. With the control plan, that gets approved through the SMS board, and we go into control plan execution. We execute the actions with urgency that is aligned to the risk. When those are complete, it goes into targeted monitoring, and either a KPI or a series of events are chosen to judge whether or not those actions were effective. If those actions were not effective, then we go back into the analysis phase and understand where did our analysis have a gap. If we see the actions were effective, we usually pick 3 to 6 months to check that. Then we take the risk on the risk register, the SRM. It goes into phase 5, which is it becomes inactive. It's still on our risk register, but it's no longer active. And if that event or hazard comes up again, we reopen. And one thing that's been very helpful, if we do have an escape in the future with this type of system, you don't have to, from scratch, create a whole root cause corrective action. You could rapidly figure out which control, preventative or recovery, failed and focus right in on that. And it helps speed the mitigations going forward. That's kind of the end-to-end on a safety risk management.
Mr. Wright, was there ever a SRA done on the experience gap, if you will, that Boeing has seen with the employees that existed essentially prior to 2020 and those that have been hired since?
In 2020, I'll kind of walk the time frame here. We did see the high amount of employee turnover, especially in manufacturing. As triggers that we noted. So we did do an SRM on employee onboarding, and we looked at our training systems, we looked at the throughput, and we did find gaps where the quantity of folks that needed to go through training didn't match our capability. And we changed the training plan and the speed of hiring to make sure that we had people go through that area. That was in around 2020. And that was an ongoing plan that had a feedback loop with improvement. If we look at post-accident, that's where we took a much fresher look at that and went to the proficiency-based model. And so now we have a safety risk management project on the employee efficiency plan that we have, but it's really an SRM that's defining that plan.
And moving back for a moment to Mr. Knapp, I believe you said earlier that the FAA is not currently involved in Boeing's SRM panel or safety risk assessment process. Is that accurate?
So we do participate in some of the Boeing SRMs to provide input on the controls and stuff that Paul talked about. So there are some SRMs that we are involved in. We are not involved in determining what makes it to the risk register for Boeing, though our findings during our auditing activity is certainly an input that they use that could drive something to their risk register.
And do you foresee that role expanding at all with the regulatory SMS coming on board?
Yes.
Could you go into a little bit more detail?
Sure. So certainly as the new rule comes on board, online and they're required to meet it, there will be additional input that they would take from us as we ensure that they are managing that system. And we will get more output from them as well to ensure that they are doing all the things that the rule says and that their policy says. So yes, we'll have more input.
Moving to the last component of the voluntary SMS and future regulatory SMS, Mr. Wright, please describe how Boeing applies the Safety Promotion Foundation.
Absolutely. I think a slide would help on this one. If we could please pull up Boeing slide 10. Thank you. So when we think about safety promotion, we, through our benchmarking, have categorized it into training for SMS and then promotion of it. And there's different communication channels that we use for those. And from a training standpoint, you can see, is my mic working okay? Seems a little quiet on my end. I don't think I can get closer. I'll keep going. Thank you kindly. So you can see that there's role-based training. That's listed on the slide for managers, for employees, around reporting. There's leaders teaching leaders as we're deploying just culture, things of that nature. And then we have an all-employee training that's brand new around positive safety culture. From a promotion standpoint, there are various channels, things you would expect, company newsletters, different stories, things like that. But I also want to point out something that was mentioned yesterday, employee engagement teams and employee involvement teams. So these are teams of employees that meet weekly to all teams to talk about safety items in their area or hazards and talk about things that need to be elevated or handled locally. We also have a program called a Safety Champions program, and we've had several hundred people through that now, which is a week-long program that has people from all aspects of Boeing. We have union members, we have different folks from engineering, we have finance, HR, what have you. And that program is open to people who have a interest in becoming part of SMS in their local area. So that's called the SMS Champions program. And that's a powerful spot where we're developing people with the capability to lead safety risk management activities and further promote locally.
So how do you know all of that's working?
Very good. Too close. All right. I was taking the previous coaching too literally. Sorry. So a few ways to know it's working. You know, culture's a challenging spot to measure. There's a lot of schools of thought on it. But one element is we look at hazard reporting through our different systems for employee safety, personal safety, that's OSHA type, and also through our Speakup process. We also do surveys with employees. So we've been conducting pulse surveys since 2021 across tens of thousands of employees at this point to understand with very specific questions around quality and safety and things like schedule pressure, things of that nature. So retaliation's part of those surveys. So part of the feedback loop to know if it's working, the employee reporting for Speakup, I look for year-over-year increases in the quantity of Speakups, and we're definitely seeing that year over year. If we look at the trend line through it, it's anywhere from twice as many from the previous year to several times as many from the previous year. Right now, we're well over 2,000 year-to-date through Speakup. The elements of the OSHA-type employee reporting, that's a more mature initiative that I used to lead prior to this role. That reporting is higher. But I look for year-over-year improvement in reporting as a key measure. And then from a promotion standpoint, that's people are understanding they need to report hazards. There's evidence there. And then the survey feedback is really key. I think part of that feedback, we actually changed and updated our anti-retaliation policy through some of that survey feedback as we've gone along our journey. So those are the two main levers I look for.
We will talk a little bit more about feedback in a moment, but before we get to that, how does Boeing define positive safety culture?
Yeah, happy to talk to that. We follow the positive safety culture methodology that's an industry standard through James Reason's work. Some of you may know of his work. He's a decorated aviation safety professional, and it has 5 elements. It's a reporting culture, a flexible culture, a learning culture, an informed culture, and a just culture. And we need to have all of those. And I've learned a lot benchmarking airline ASAPs. I've had the very good fortune to be permitted to sit in on a few ASAPs at airlines and understand what that looks like. And those are the 5 elements that we have for our program.
So what are some examples of positive safety culture or positive safety culture behavior that you would expect from touch labor?
I would expect touch labor to report hazards, and what we want to see, and expect is the wrong word because you can't expect somebody to feel a way. But what we want to see is employees reporting good faith mistakes without fear of reprisal. And in that way, that unlocks the rest of that whole positive safety culture system, because that allows the learning, the informed part. Flexible is about change. And it all comes down to employees feeling safe to report.
Same question, but let's say for Tier 1 managers, what examples of positive safety culture behavior would you expect from them?
This is part of our implementation. In a just culture, we need first-line managers to think differently when they're seeing behavior that is not aligned with our policies or procedures. And there's a model that James Reason, we follow that model too, has, and it's part of our safety culture guiding principles that we're deploying to our managers to help them understand, is this it gets through things like, is this a malicious act? Is this a reckless act? Would other people in the group do the same act? What's the motivations? Was it for personal gain, for organizational gain? And it helps you walk through, and this is what I would expect our first line managers to do in our Just Culture program, to make sure that we don't have employees go into a corrective action, a punitive part of our processes, unless it was part of that early on, part of the rules that we've learned from the airlines. reckless behavior, things like that, or malicious behavior. And there's very set rules for that. And what that does is it starts to build that trust that employees can come forth. And one of the ways that I think we'll know we're getting there is when employees report their own mistakes.
As the manager overall, or the vice president for the program, how confident are you that Boeing's touch labor employees recognize what a positive safety culture is and can adhere to these behaviors?
This is a new space for us. I think what it's going to take is employees seeing repetition. You know, we talk about the tri-party agreement with the event review committee. That's quite new in our space, and we're just starting to get some repetition there. So I think we're at the beginning of that journey.
Given that safety promotion as a whole is a process used to communicate, develop, and sustain safety within an organization, how would you rate the overall effectiveness of this foundation of your SMS at this point in the voluntary SMS?
Sure. I would say that our improvements are on the right track from a trajectory, but the magnitude clearly needs to move faster. So what I mean by that is like Speakup reporting year over year.
Why we have to have this contentious relationship instead of just doing the right thing. So I have, it all sounds very good. It sounds really great. In action on the factory floor, it is not what it appears to be here in this meeting.
So to be clear, Mr. Catlin, I'm asking about how does the IAM perceive the behaviors of touch labor in accordance with a positive safety culture on the factory floor?
Well, I think that, again, as we spoke about yesterday, we have a very large majority of new hires at the Boeing company that have, one of the things that was just spoken about is that back in 2020 there was an acknowledgement of the throughput through Boeing's training. For the last several years, we've been seeing 150 to 200 new hires coming in a week. Boeing's training in foundational training has been working with upwards of 800 people working their way through foundational training time. The people who have been going through foundational training right up until the January 5th event were being cut loose to the floor with very substandard training. I don't know that our manufacturing and quality personnel, our touch labor on the floor, truly have an understanding of Boeing's SMS and the safety culture and everything else, because I don't believe the training was provided to them when they came in.
So independent of Boeing, what is the union doing to get involved in promoting safety culture amongst your union members on the factory floor?
We are continually out there having conversations with our members. I personally am on the factory floor on a regular basis, having shop floor meetings and conversations with our members. The problem is, we don't have a seat at the table.
Do you feel that just because you do not have a seat at the table, you are unable to influence your members?
It's not a matter of we're not able to influence our members. We do hold our monthly union meetings. We do have our Aero Mechanic newspaper, where we do run informational stuff in those. But to call our membership together, we're talking 32,500 members. We would have to hold our union meetings in T-Mobile Park like we just did for our strike sanctions event.
But you do have meetings and you do have a newsletter. So, again, what types of issues do you discuss in those limited forums that you do have that help to encourage a positive safety culture?
We run a lot of articles in our Aero Mechanic that talk about things that deal with safety, things where we have had an impact on safety around the workplace. And to add to it, we also worked through to get this tri-party agreement that gets us a seat at the table, so that our members, when they do file Speakup reports and have concerns, we have IAM members who are reviewing those concerns.
There are a lot of different companies and a lot of different elements that go into a piece of sheet metal becoming an airplane. There's a lot of different hands that touch that process. Who ultimately should be involved, not responsible for, but should be involved in creating a positive safety culture according to the union?
Everybody.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wright, we've talked a lot, extensively actually, about Boeing's Speakup program, and I don't want to go into all of those details again because I do feel like a lot of it has been discussed. Some of the points I want to make, I won't have you describe the process again. I feel like that's been done adequately. But who has oversight for that process?
Oversight fits in two pieces. One is the facilitation of the process to make sure that the speakups enter into the process and get assigned and move through the system at the right rate depending on the speakup. So there's an oversight body, and then there's the different organizations around the company that are responsible for addressing the speak-ups, which tend to be local groups. They're varied. So the safety office provides the oversight of the process, and then we do raise up any speak-ups that are out of process if they're not meeting timeline or not having adequate closure. And this has been in place for probably about 14 months, just to get the timeline. We bring those to the CEO of the business unit, and that's done on a every week basis, and it goes through, no, it's every other week. Sorry, we had a cadence change. And the leaders for those areas, the senior leaders, have to describe what's being done to make sure that any speak up that is not being addressed at the right speed or adequately, what's being done to address that.
Again, we've talked a lot about the process, and I've read through your BPI on speak-ups, and I feel like I have a good understanding of what happens after it's submitted. But I want to talk a little bit more about the tactical level of how does a mechanic actually submit? Walk me through that process, please.
Sure. The mechanic goes to the shared workstation, pulls up, the Boeing front page comes up on everybody's workstation. You might have to click on the Boeing home button. And then Speakup is an icon right on the front page. You click on your Speakup, and I'll tell you from personal experience, I use the system. You go ahead and type out what element you're concerned about. For me, maybe I'm writing a process hazard. And then I have the option to pick anonymous or confidential. If I pick anonymous, if I pick confidential, my employee number, they call it a BEMS ID, goes into the system so that a trained person can talk to me and ask me if I want to be part of the solution or if I want to just remain confidential. If I click anonymous, a 0 goes into the field where the employee number would be. You can't see that, but that's what happens in the system for anonymity. And then you hit send, and it heads off. Now, that is prior to the accident. Post-accident, we're adding a couple fields in there to help make sure that we get hazards addressed more quickly. So it gets into what type of hazard and some location information to help us triangulate the resources better. Employees don't have to fill it out, but it's helpful if they do. There, it gets into the process that I think you've looked through.
So we heard from Spirit earlier, and they have a similar process. I think they call it 360.
Yes, Quality 360.
Quality 360. Thank you for that.
Yes.
But it sounds like, unlike theirs, which is accessible from anywhere, is that accurate, and by anyone?
Yes, that's correct.
Does Boeing have that same level of accessibility to access their Speakup program?
We do have a QR code, but it needs to be a device inside the system.
Do you have any concerns at all in trying to maintain anonymity, or anybody who would want to do so, about having a feedback process that's only contained within the internal system?
Always willing to consider new ideas for sure. But where I see the trust really being built is through our actions and through repetition. If we tell people they're anonymous, and through repetition, as we have thousands and thousands and thousands of speak-ups, nobody's anonymity is compromised, I think that's how we build trust with the floor, is through action. We could tell them that it's anonymous because it's outside the firewall. I don't know that that builds trust as much as actions. But I still am open to ideas.
And Paul, if I may, Dr. Woods, based on some of the feedback that we had received post-accident in the last few months, one of the sub-elements of our plan is to look at the reporting system that we use for Speakup and see if we can make other technology enhancements to address some of the things you're bringing up as far as how to help make it more accessible, like Spirit has discussed, but also help increase that level of anonymity.
So if a change is made as a result of a submission, let's say it's anonymous and not somebody who's put in their information to their talk to, how is that change communicated back to the factory as a whole?
That's a good one. The way that we approach that, and I should say that even an anonymous employee gets a URL that they can click on, or have anybody click on to see the status of that Speakup. It's a one-way look. But the way that we found the best is to either through a broad enough set of crew meetings, because we don't want to have a conversation that would imply that we know who that person is. So if you have just a single crew and say, hey, we're making this change, that might make somebody nervous. So we do it a little more broadly, and also through organizational newsletters and bulletins and things like that. We communicate changes from Speakup through those, and those are in a way that gives the person more security that their anonymity has been protected.
Going back to you, Mr. Catlin, what role does the union play in aiding their members through the feedback process?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Aiding our members through Boeing's feedback process?
Yes. So if somebody has a question, let's say you have a member who comes to their union representative and says, I have this problem, I don't know what to do with it next, I would like to provide feedback. Go.
So me personally, I get contacted on a regular basis by our members who have issues, and I usually always direct them to the Speakup process first. And I walk them through the process. But we have a lot of members that don't even know what Speakup is. I'm sure that there's been stuff put out. I'm sure that they have seen it, but they don't understand the process. So I help them get into the system, file the Speakup, tell them to keep their URL number so they can gain access to it. But beyond that, we don't really have a role in the feedback loop with the Boeing company.
I recognize that, but you have a better understanding of what to do than maybe that mechanic that's on the floor. So again, as you put, you would help the person through the process. How confident are you that all of your union reps out there are doing the same should they be asked from one of your members?
Not confident. I mean, we have many of our business reps who were business reps before Speakup rolled out. So to them, they would not have the knowledge.
Going back to Boeing, Mr. Wright, what role do the touch labor technicians, the mechanics on the factory floor, have in ensuring a successful SMS?
Really several places. Hazard reporting, like we've noted, best source of information, I think arguably in our whole safety assurance system is the employees. They see hazards before anybody. Hazard resolution is also a key part of it. We do find when the employees are part of the solution, so like on a Speakup where it's confidential and the employee agrees to be part of the solution. And I should be clear, I have a lot of Speakups that start with my name is, and I want to be part of this. It's definitely, it goes in many places. Those are when we have the best solutions, is with the employee involved, making sure that the solution makes sense. And it's not something that is developed with some side team and tries to solve a problem without having constant feedback on it. And that's definitely an element of it, is the reporting, but also part of the solution. And in this traveled work safety risk assessment process that was mentioned, when we go to the airplane and talk directly with the mechanic and ask the human factors questions around, is the tools or equipment there? Can we keep the employees safe? Can we keep the airplane safe? And talk about things like access and how many people, and is there going to be overbuild? Is this your fourth consecutive weekend of overtime? Things like that. We get a much better answer with that direct teaming.
My last set of questions is the transition that you're about to undertake. Can you please explain the process for how Boeing intends to transition from a voluntary to a regulatory SMS program?
Certainly. Maybe just to help me with this, we'll pull up Boeing slide 7, please. But I don't have to wait for the chart too long. We're evaluating the rule right now. So we certainly have a team that's in my organization evaluating the rule and looking for gaps to our voluntary program between the voluntary and the regulated. And as we see those gaps, we're putting our plan together that's due, as Dr. Ike mentioned. The primary example of a gap that I've seen so far, really the main gap, is the reporting hazards to interfacing organizations that Dr. Ike also mentioned. This makes a lot of sense. And when we think about that, we already have a way to report hazards that are event-based. I talked about that with notification of escapement. What's being added is the proactive part of the SMS, the change management part. Things are changing. We want to see these things, and how do we get our hazards understood? So we are part of an OEM working group, and that group is tasked with making standards so that those hazards can be communicated effectively and efficiently. But there's work to be done, and I think that's the biggest gap, and I think it's one of the most important ones that we have, is that having hazards up and down the value stream understood. That's where SMS really comes together for me, because as you know, supply chain comes to Boeing, that could be an issue. Boeing to an operator or an airline, that could be an issue. Airlines to passengers, that could be an issue, and we all have to have a flow of hazard knowledge to respond to this in the best way.
Will the personnel that are currently responsible and have the most knowledge about your voluntary SMS change during this transition time?
No. My organization is going to be transitioning from an implementation organization to more of an oversight organization, but we will be including others more broadly, because managing the full set of risks takes many hands.
And this might have already been answered when we discussed safety policy earlier, but how does Boeing intend to assure that all levels, all the way down to the touch labor, are going to understand their roles in the regulatory SMS?
I see this through a few areas, and I might see if you could help me a little here, Hector, too, as we go. But certainly training and promotion. But as we think about that regular interaction with the production floor, that close coupled nature with the quality management system, that's how they get information today. And we don't want to confuse people with lots of different channels of information, so we try to line up on using our existing systems and embedding SMS into how they work. So there'll be training, but I think it's also going to be part of our regular quality management system engagement with employees. Anything to add?
Well, certainly the two complement each other. I'll add specifically, we launched a new SMS and positive safety culture training course in our foundational training. So far, we've had about 400 folks go through it. We've gotten really positive feedback so far. That's something we want to scale. But that's an opportunity to catch folks, not just at the beginning of their Boeing careers, but we also need to look at how we implement recurrent training and then make sure we catch folks that have all come on boarded here recently as well.
This question is for the FAA essentially, and I'm going to actually start back to you, Mr. Schlegel, because I had asked you previously when we met, I had asked you this question, At that time, when you were helping aid Boeing through their transition into a voluntary SMS, did you feel that they were poised and ready to transition to what would eventually become the regulatory SMS?
Yes, at that time, I felt they were ready to transition. They had all the elements in place, maybe not fully mature and fully permeated through the entire organization, but they had the basic foundation. So the transition to a regulatory SMS, adding a few of the things that they need to complete the organizational system description, and then also putting together how they're going to complete their confidential employer report summary. Those couple things to be added. I think they're well suited to move forward.
And now to you, Mr. Knopp, present day state, how, or I guess where does the FAA right now interact with Boeing's transition to a regulatory SMS? Is there a level of involvement there, or is it essentially when you're ready to present to us what you have, we'll look at what you have?
So we still participate in how I previously talked about in their voluntary SMS. We are awaiting Boeing's implementation plan that's mandated by the rule, and certainly will review that, obviously, when it comes in, and go from there from meeting the specifics of the rule. We certainly provide advice, as we've always had done since they've been in the voluntary system. But for the regulated part of their SMS, we're awaiting the implementation plan.
And then the last question I have also for the FAA is that you have the ASIs that you have currently. They did not have that responsibility. That responsibility is coming, and with that, I'm sure new training. But do you anticipate a change in manpower at all for your staffing levels to provide that additional oversight that a regulatory SMS might require?
Yes, we certainly are increasing staffing within our branch and other areas for many reasons, and one of those is to ensure we can do proper oversight of SMS.
Okay, thank you. With that, Mr. Brazy, that's all the questions that I have.
Madam Chair.
Thank you very much to the technical panel. Great questions. We're going to take a 10-minute break, but I mean 10 minutes, so be back here at 12:40 because I'm starting without you.